following the events of this chapter, I think it's safe to assume all the stuff going on in Onigatsuki, the whole stuff under Mount Black Moon, is at its conclusion. I'm pretty sure we're going to be going into the next portion of the story, going to the next part of the arc, just given like the crazy way that the chapter ends. But over the chapter itself, the big question, I think, just out of everything that went down so far within this last sequence within the series, is how Yoko actually did as a character. How well did she perform? And the big question to me, beyond that, is what will Celine do following the defeat of one of her Moonlit Beauty Gods? Because I'm still in complete curiosity state of if she's going to just replace Yoko. Like, I'm very curious of her whole method of how she picked the Moonlit Beauty Gods. Like, did she end up kind of like picking like people specifically based off strength? Or could she, say, pick another person and then power them up so they're as strong as Yoko, like just already, using all her crazy, dragon abilities that she has that we haven't seen yet? Because Celine has to have a bunch that just she hasn't decided to put on screen. Like, we've mostly just seen her teleport. But it wouldn't surprise me if she could just buff another character up. Like, as the whole status of like people like Yoko, Hakune, Mimi, they're all fodder to her. Like, they're all fodder in comparison to Celine. Like, not compared to individuals in the main cast. Granted, Yoko, like, in a realistic time, had not a good time with Erza, but obviously that's a bit different than her first encounter with Erza. Like, her first encounter, or like Erza without Wendy's help can't damage Yoko's yokai. Like, the only way I would guess that she could would be with her Nakagami armor, if it could also affect spiritual arts, but that's an if. Like, we don't know if that could exactly. It's stated specifically against magic, so that would just come down to maybe like if Erza could figure out a way to do it or to adjust her armor. That's a complete, question mark in of itself. But without Wendy, we can just assume that she would have a bad time fighting Yoko. Granted, if it wasn't for the smoke one that made it so she couldn't breathe, there's the possibility that she could just like fight her yokai as they're coming and then go after Yoko. Because that's also like a completely valid thing that you could just do against the summoner. Like, there's nothing stopping Erza from just saying, screw the monsters, I'm going after you. Like, I don't need to worry about these creatures at all if I just go straight for the summoner. But Yoko, overall, I actually think Yoko did pretty good, because in a 1v1, I would expected her to have a lot better performance, just because, like I said, regardless of the Moonlit Beauty Gods being, relatively new characters, there's not really any hype around them outside of, who they're, directly associated with. But that is still, like, a big thing. Being directly adjacent to Celine is, in of itself, a pretty big hype piece. The questions, following that would just really depend on how exactly, again, they're ranked for Celine. Like, could Celine just replace them relatively easily? Okune's the only one that I don't know if it'd just be, like, an easier place. Even, whether Celine could just pick a new person, or if she could just power up a person and make them as powerful as Yoko or something. Hakune's a little different just because she's got, like, a really broken ability. Like, Mimi, we don't really know the description of what her spiritual art is. The only thing we know is that she's very physically strong. If there's anything beyond that, which I hope so, because just physical strength, I don't think is that impressive for her. I think that would be kind of like, just based off the fact, I mean, she is directly set next to Moonlit, next to Celine, and then when you see the other Moonlit Beauty Gods, they're still way more impressive, because even Yoko's whole summoning method is actually pretty well-rounded. Like, combining that with her ability to make, like, copies and clones out of Shikigami in order to, prevent herself from getting hurt and people finding her. And then flight, like, combining her infinite yokai spam with these two other things is actually a really well-rounded set. And none of her yokai really do anything that crazy. Like, she doesn't seem to have any real, not a lot of, like, hacks. She doesn't have, like, a lot of broken abilities, but it's just that all her abilities at their base level work really well together. I thought that was actually a really well-rounded moveset. Because, again, if they can't deal, say, with the yokai, and they have to go after her, but then she can just fly away, she can just make a bunch of copies, it really would just come down to Yoko's level of caution. Granted, like, with Erza, she had a bad opponent, because Erza was able to figure out which one is the real Yoko, just based off of things like how she sounds, stuff like that, with, like, her breathing, and everything like that. She was just using a lot of more body language, and not like body language, but I guess like body emissions, I want to say. But she's a lot smarter when it comes to just outright combat. So Yoko has had a bad day. If she challenged him 1v1 again, I think that would be a whole different story. But you gotta keep in mind, Yoko decided to challenge the entire main cast, and I think her alternative was a much riskier, much more dangerous pathway to go down. Just from, like, angering Celine. We know Celine's whole thing is she's driven by her want to be entertained, to have a good time, essentially just to have fun while just doing her thing. She literally has one thing in mind, and that's her own self-enjoyment. So Celine bored, Celine upset, and, you know, the fact that she is, you know, centuries old of a super powerful dragon who has absolutely zero regard to how many worlds she has to destroy in order to have her fun. Like, she says, like, who cares if a world or two is wiped out and defiled if it means getting what I want. So, say if Yoko decided not to go after the main cast for when Celine was upset, Celine probably would have just killed her. Like, I don't really have any doubt that Celine would be completely ruthless like that. Again, she is an ancient dragon. She's not going to care about, like, one random person, especially one that is directly in line of what's pissing her off. Because at the end of the day, even if she's comes off pretty nice and she hasn't gone, like, psycho-aggressive yet, she still has shown complete insane person tendencies. I mean, like, again, we can look at some of the panels where she's just kind of talking. She's definitely crazy, but, you know, it is what it is. Against the main cast, she definitely had a worse than probably expected for her, like, just road ahead of her. Like, she probably wasn't aware exactly, like, how bad it was going to go down. But anybody who knows the main cast knows what they're capable of. All of them together is like, no, there's no way Yoko can take them. The fact that Yoko did as well as she did is actually what's more impressive to me. Because I talked about, I don't remember if it was I think it was in my predictions of this chapter and in the last review. I don't think Yoko was going to do a very good job. Like, again, just because who she was up against was just too much for her. She couldn't take on the entire main cast. Like, they're too well-rounded all, like, collectively together. Like, as the big thing that she has that can, you know, be a threat to, say, like, Wendy and then Erza is, like, the big smoke yokai. But it's like you have Natsu and Gray there. Like, Natsu could easily just kind of, like, do an explosion, blow the smoke body away, or Gray could freeze it. Gray has frozen fire, he's frozen wind, so freezing a non-physical being is completely within his realm of possibilities. Especially with Wendy's conceptual enchant making it so they can affect spiritual art-based abilities. It wasn't looking good for Yoko as soon as she stepped in this battle. But she actually did better than I expected. So, one thing in the chapter that actually made me really happy. So, in the last one, Lucy did, you know, really OP thing by summoning all of her gold keys and one silver key. Blue pretty much was just summoned for fun. Like, Blue's not going to do anything. But summoning her 10 gold keys was huge, especially with no keys in general. She just summoning the Zodiacs right there in front of her. No issue, no problem, just does it. And which makes sense. We know that in Ellentir they got, like, an extreme boost in power. And then with Erza in this chapter, I'm actually surprised this wasn't her transcended magic. It just had to do with her, you know, using an armor that she wouldn't normally use in combat. With Lucy, though, Lucy went into also Stardress Mix in the last chapter. She didn't stay in it, but she didn't look that exhausted in comparison to where she was the first two times that we see her Stardust Mix. The first time we see her use it against Mira Jane's group when she's controlled by Ferris, she goes into her Leo x Virgo form, gets off one spell, and then pretty much is knocked out of the form. You know, similar to when Natsu first used Lightning Flame Dragon mode after Sirius Island, when he used it against Max, right after the Roar, he pretty much collapsed. That's how Lucy was to a degree. She didn't fall over, and just from pure exhaustion, but she had no magic left to use to at least stay in the form. She could still had a little bit left, because she still had some of her spirit. She stayed in her star dress, but it's still at the same time, it's using enough that you are pretty much just immediately pulled out of your form is not it's not like a sign of, oh yeah, you're good. And it's like, no, you are running on small bits of power at that point. But when it comes to how she did in this chapter, she wasn't in the form anymore, but she still had all her spirits up. She didn't really look tired. Like, the closest thing is she was, like, running from a yokai and had, like, a sweat mark, but I think that was more of, like, the running from danger thing instead of, like, exhausted, low on magic thing. So, very impressive for Lucy, just as, like, the small piece of follow-up that she got in this chapter. She didn't have much spotlight in this. Her spirits had some good moments of just, like, you know, being on display, doing their things, but Lucy's moment was more in the last chapter, and then probably will be whenever she gets her next 1v1 fight, seeing like how powerful she's going to be. I did a video on you know, Lucy's potential possible moves, if you want to go check that out. But Erza's going up against Yoko. Yoko ends up making herself into yokai, which I was very happy about. The fact that Yoko lost in this chapter was just like, okay, well, it would just depend on what did she do since her stepping up and coming forward. And we saw the stuff last chapter, obviously, with her general yokai spam, her flight, her ability to make the like little Shikigami copy, so she, you know, they can't hit her. She also has the ability to turn herself into a yokai. And when I first read that chapter, I was wondering, like, does this yokai have any abilities? Is she just turning herself into a physical fighter? You know, and usually when it would come to like something like this, I would expect a really powerful ability on top of that. But to be perfectly honest, if she is a classic summoner, or she's set to not get hurt, not take physical damage, being able to turn herself into a yokai where suddenly she has a lot of physical force, sword skill, she's got 4 swords to keep slashing her opponent, and she's able just to completely, in most cases, overwhelm. Like, if she's anywhere close to trouble for Erza in swordsmanship, then that's actually a pretty significant boost. That's one of those things that's like, if a character's gonna have super strength, like if Mimi does, like if her spiritual art is just a type of super strength, I think it needs to be ridiculous super strength. Like, I want to see her literally one hand pick up a mountain, or like, instead of cleave and take out some trees, I want to see like her chop something all the way at the horizon. Just when it's one of those over the top levels of a basic attack kind of thing. Just from the fact that it's so plain and so kind of standard that it should be way over the top of what you'd expect. And that's actually what Yoko got with Erza, because there wasn't like any crazy displays of it, other than obviously you'd have to keep in mind how skilled and strong Erza is, which, you know, she clearly is. Like, anybody who's gotten this far in the series know that Erza isn't, she's not weak, she's actually, you know, she's very physically strong, she's got a lot of skill, a lot of technique. But I actually assumed when the chapter came out that Erza was going to be using her transcendent magic. And I know when the chapter dropped, and I checked some of the dialogue, that it had information like saying she was using the SE plugs. I didn't know the whole description of it. But at the same time, hers was the same thing where I was like, does it have any special abilities, or is this just 6 swords? But like, the thing about her armor, which I'm very curious about following this, because she describes it's pretty much was used primarily for the Magnolia Harvest Festival parade. So it was more like a ceremonial on display armor set, if anything. It's not the same way as one set for combat. And one of the things about the SE plugs, if you remember the car from way back in the Eisenwald arc, they require a lot of magic just to use in general. Like, even if their function isn't crazy, it just seems to take a lot of magic just to operate them at all. Like, Erza, even at the beginning of the series, was within Wizard Saint area, and she was only able to use that car for like a couple 100 miles from from town to town. Which, I mean, it's still sort of impressive when you think about, like, that's still a fair distance with a car, but at the same time, it's like, Erza has so much magic, obviously, at her level, you'd expect it to run away more, but it just always has been displayed that the magic tech just requires way more than you'd expect for its operation in magic. But when it came down to this, I assumed that when it, like, with this versus, say, Heaven's Wheel or Atraxia armor, that it's more like way more skill and technique based. Like, instead of, telepathically kind of, throwing her swords or slashing an opponent with them, it would be essentially like if she did have more sets of arms that operate exactly like her regular arms. So probably more skill, technique, precision based and whatnot. I like to comment when Yoko is attacking her and she's like, you can't just defend with 4 arms. And then Erza puts up this armor, which he calls it like 1,000 arms armor. And just is like, oh, okay. And then just starts attacking her. And it's like, you can't do anything with just 4 arms. And I was actually really expecting, like, with the naming, if she could make more arms. But I don't think so. Because at the end of the chapter, or the end of the fight, rather, when she goes out of the armor, she's actually sweating pretty fairly. And that's one of the things that actually made me really impressed with Yoko. Is because Yoko was at least able to put up enough of a fight that Erza showed signs of being tired, of exhausted. I'm using a lot of magic. That sweating and whatnot shows that she is, was put to work. And even if Yoko didn't have, say, like some big, like, barely beat Erza in a fight or something, it's like, no, but she still required Erza to put up, like, a good amount of effort. Which, again, was more than I expected when she was up against the whole main cast. I didn't think she was going to do that well. Like, I was just hoping she would do okay, and she would show off some cool abilities. And she did do one of the ones that I was most curious about. Because when it came to her yokai, we got, like, Wendy just uses Raise, cancels out the yokai. And it wasn't the same as what I thought it was going to be the separation enchantment. So I thought it was more of like, they took a yokai and they, fused it with a person, and that's how it made the yokai versions of the characters. But it seems more like she turned them into yokai by applying spiritual arts to them, which is something, like, we know that they had spiritual power put into them, and obviously turned into yokai, but I didn't think it was that straightforward. Like, she's just transforming them with the power, rather than the yokai themselves, being influenced on the people. So I was happy that she did that. I'm curious to know, like, if she I don't think Erza killed her. So, is she gonna have, like, another scene? I don't know. If she does, I'm hoping she shows, like, maybe 1 or 2 more yokai forms before her character's gone. If not, I think that Celine will kill her. If Celine kills her, that's completely different. Celine could just end her next chapter, and we don't see any more of Yoko, and maybe Yoko gets replaced. But if Yoko doesn't die and she comes back, like she has another part in the arc, I'm hoping she would have more yokai forms than just this one. This one I'm just hoping she picked because Erza, Erza was a swordsman and she wanted to try and overwhelm Erza. She obviously doesn't know all of Erza's armors, so I wouldn't expect her to see something like this coming at all. That wouldn't be a fair assumption for her. But the big meat of the chapter. The big meat of the chapter was the very end. Because I really liked what happened with Erza, Yoko, and again, I'm happy with Yoko's display. I didn't expect her to perform as well as she did, just given where she was going to be at against all these important people with all their crazy abilities that all combined against, that all would combine and work well against her. But she put up a good fight against Erza. Like, again, Erza was sweating pretty well, so obviously Erza actually had to put in some effort to defeat her. But the big craziness at the end of the chapter was what made me the most hype, because Natsu is now in front of Suzaku. And it's the best case scenario for getting to see what Suzaku can do. And that's one of the things, obviously, a lot of people have been wondering. If Suzaku, what exactly does a red dragon do? And a lot of people have been going with the fire aspect, the heat-based thing, because of his color and the whole tie to the phoenix and his design. It's still a possibility. I don't think so. I really want to go with, the whole blood thing. Because when it comes to, if it's a heat-based thing, then Natsu's going to have absolutely zero problem in the next chapter. The only thing he's going to have to look out for is the sword. But if it's a heat-based sword, if it's a fire sword, then he just has to catch it and then just pull all the, eat all the heat off it, eat all the fire off it. Whereas if it's blood, then that's a completely different story. He can't just eat that. But like I said, Natsu being the one in front of him is the best case scenario for just for what they're doing. Like, and on top of that, like, if it was, say, Lucy would be, I mean, Suzaku is obviously stronger than Lucy, but like if you put Lucy in that scenario, she's gonna try and talk to Suzaku, even if it's mid-fight, even if she's like running away and trying not to get shot. She's still gonna try and talk to him because like Lucy's a pretty intelligent character. I think she would figure it out that there's some issue, especially if Suzaku says anything. That'd be like, if he said anything about Fairy Tail that made him seem like he thought they were a villain, she'd probably try and clarify it. Wendy would probably try and talk to him. Gray, I think Gray would be a little bit more combative, but also be like reasonable. He'd do the same thing if like he said anything suspicious about like Fairy Tail being the bad guy's enemy. He'd probably try and talk to him. Same thing with Erza. The thing about Natsu though, the second Suzaku shows any signs of aggression towards him or members of his guild, Natsu's gonna want to throw hands. The second he says anything about like fighting Fairy Tail, Natsu's gonna throw hands. Natsu's not gonna take that. He is absolutely not going to, try to be like, oh, well, okay, let's think diplomatically. He's like, no, if you're gonna throw threats my way, then we're gonna fight. It's just how they're gonna be. And we already know Suzaku said that if Fairy Tail gets in their way, then he's gonna go through them. So I'm very excited to see like how that interaction goes, because that fight can easily start out within the first few pages of the chapter. Really, just a couple of words between them, just based off of like how Natsu is and what Suzaku has established so far with this character. They're going to be very quick to fight, and I really am excited for it. Like I've been excited for like a bunch of chapters, like obviously throughout it. Like I'm generally excited for chapters, just because the series itself. Then there's like specific chapters that I am hyped about, like when we got the Ellen tier, finding out new lore about that. But like this is close to like when Nebel said he was or Nibar and the officials said he was going to go Dragon Force, and I was super hyped just to get to the next chapter and finding out what it does. And that's about the same level of hype I am right now, because though we don't know the full amount of content in the next chapter, and we don't know exactly what's going to happen, we know that it should contain and start out with the interaction between Natsu and Suzaku, which again can very easily go to a fight. So again, I'm excited about that. I can't wait to see how that goes and how this this story is going to progress with this scene as soon as the next chapter starts. But anyway, other than that, comment below, tell me your thoughts about this chapter, and tell me like what was your favorite part about this. I really liked Erza's Norma. I thought it was cool. Still, we got her Transcendent Magic coming up, which is hype. This wasn't it, so we're gonna see whatever crazy thing she has at some point. It could just be more magic, but I don't know. Either way, other than that, comment below, thumbs up the video, friend the like button, and the subscribe button, and check out my videos. But other than that, appreciate everybody's already subscribed. Thank you all for listening. Bye.